Houston, we have a problem. Only don't look to corporate media to tell you about it because they don't think it's all that bad.
The New York Fed out with its second quarter of 2025 household debt and credit report. It shows the household debt increased by a modest 1%, up $185 billion to a large number of $18.4 trillion. The more important question of delinquencies, they remain elevated for auto loans and for credit card debt. But student loan delinquencies, because of a change in how they're treated, they have surged. Overall delinquency rates, though, remain relatively modest if you take out student loans. Up, but not at a worrisome level yet without the student loans.
All right, so I counted 2 modists and 1 not worrisome in just that brief clip. So other than that clip, the actual New York Fed household debt release itself, and a handful of mentions in traditional media, I defy you to find any true mainstream reporting on this release. But contained within it is all you need to know about the pressure building inside the massive household debt bubble that will unequivocally be the thing that drives us from the Trump recession into the Trump depression. So today, we're going to briefly address the elements of this release, why they're so important, and then we're going to zero in on the student debt figures that are absolutely staggering. But we're going to go one step further for the Meidas Mighty. We're going to actually talk about what needs to be done if and when normal people ever take over running this country again. That's right. It can't all just be delivering bad news and diagnosis. Sometimes it's okay to actually prescribe. So stick with me here, and we're going to talk about how to actually solve one aspect of the debt crisis. So let's go. U.S. government statistics. Get them while you can, boys and girls, because we're at that chapter of the dictator playbook where they start firing the statisticians. But there's no hiding from this release from the New York Fed. What you're looking at here is the total level of household debt in the United States. According to the release, mortgage balances grew by $131 billion during the second quarter of 2025 and totaled $12.9 trillion by the end of June. Balances on home equity lines of credit, or HELOCs, rose by $9 billion, the 13th consecutive quarterly increase. That's a lot of debt, and we're all in these numbers, every one of us. Debt and consumer credit are inescapable in today's world unless you exist so far up the economic ladder that you can afford to pay for everything in cash. And you don't have to be one of the billionaires who flies to outer space for fun to be in this club either, but you do have to be pretty well heeled. But so far, we've just looked at the housing portion of total debt, and it's crippling enough. But there's way more to the consumer debt picture than just housing. After all, 35% of the population rents. So let's dig a bit deeper. Taking housing out of the equation, and the figures are still overwhelming and getting worse. Again, according to the release, credit card balances rose by $27 billion during the second quarter and now total $1.2 trillion outstanding and are 5.8% above the level a year ago. Auto loan balances rose by $13 billion and now stand at $1.6 trillion. Other balances, which include retail cards and consumer finance loans, were roughly unchanged at $540 billion. But student loan balances edged up by $7 billion and now stand at a whopping $1.6 trillion. So in total, non-housing balances increased by $45 billion. Now, one more chart for good measure, because debt isn't always a bad thing. Ever since the expansion of credit starting in the 1950s with the advent of longer-term mortgages, if you were white, and credit cards, if you were a white male, growth in the economy and individual economic mobility was dependent upon access to credit and, of course, the ability to manage it comfortably. There were myriad factors that contributed to the growth of the U.S. economy and the rise of the middle class from World War II through the mid-1970s, but no factor more significant than the rise of credit. But like I said, access is one thing. The ability to manage it comfortably is another entirely. And so here's where the cracks aren't just beginning to show, they're swallowing up entire segments of the population. What you see here, delinquencies across the board are increasing at an alarming rate. Now, obviously, the biggest jump here is in student debt delinquency. But student loans, credit card debt, and auto loans are all approaching 2010 global financial crisis levels. This is a 5-alarm fire. But the mainstream media doesn't appear to think so because mortgage and HELOC delinquencies, while on the rise, are still relatively low compared to the mortgage crisis fallout. Look, to the extent that many of us are still traumatized by the financial crisis and what happened in the housing market, I get why the mainstream media would take that position. So long as we don't have a repeat of 08 and 09, we can theoretically get by. But this is where I come back to our central thesis that the Trump economy isn't exploding like the housing bubble burst. It's imploding. And the mainstream media simply does not care about the lower rungs of the economic ladder. But the data are irrefutable. The housing credit figures only account for 65% of the population that own a home. Credit card debt is a mixed bag, and so are auto loans because those are distributed across the population. But the subprime auto defaults and delinquencies are through the roof. Furthermore, there's a correlation between housing and student debt that a lot of people aren't taking into account. According to the National Association of Realtors, 37% of first-time homebuyers have an average of $30,000 in student loans. So as wages and salaries compress, these balances become tougher and tougher to negotiate. So more to the point, the NAR also says that 61% of non-homeowning millennials said that student loan debt is delaying their ability to buy a home. So the debt picture is way more nuanced and more interconnected than ever before. Because wealth inequality has widened so much in the past few decades, the single biggest asset the average American relies on for a dignified retirement is a buildup of home equity. There are so many layers to this story, but the headline takeaway should be that we are once again reaching new heights in terms of household debt. Now, let's go back to a chart that we shared in our last video that came out before these revised debt numbers even came out to really put this in context. In the last video, we talked about how consumer spending is still going up, which is why some economists and TV pundits interpret this as a sign of a healthy consumer. But just asking the next question, where are they spending the money, reveals the opposite. Healthcare, housing, utilities, insurance, food, clothing, durable goods, that's where the money's going. And since we know more people are unemployed and staying out of the workforce for longer periods of time, and among those who are employed, we know that wages and salaries are just keeping pace with inflation, but not higher than inflation, then the consumer debt figures explain how consumer spending can still increase. We're paying for it all on credit, baby. The American way. Now, let's get out of diagnosis mode and get into policy prescriptions. Let's narrow the discussion to the one metric that just blew off the charts. Student debt. See, because I believe that children are the future. Teach them well and let them lead the way. Show them all the... Seriously though, student debt is obviously a nightmare. Just a few years ago though, it seemed like we might actually be getting somewhere as student debt forgiveness was a campaign issue, especially during the 2020 Democratic primary. And as you might imagine, I'm on the Bernie wing of the political spectrum, so I was all for large-scale forgiveness. But forgiveness alone doesn't fix the root cause of the problem. Even still, a compromise was made at the time when Bernie dropped out because the Biden team promised to issue $10,000 in forgiveness across the board with up to $20,000 in forgiveness in certain instances. Of course, this got watered down when the establishment Dems revolted and gutted Build Back Better and split it into two bills. So what came out of it ultimately was forgiveness for student debt holders who worked for a determined amount of time in public service. Fine, great. At least something was done. But again, forgiveness is just a piece of a much larger puzzle. So in the spirit of arming the Meidas Mighty with some proper talking points to demand of our future representatives on this issue, here's a better, or at least more comprehensive approach. Time is of the essence here because if we're to believe Project 2025, and at this point, if you don't, you're on another planet, then the goal of this administration is to close the Department of Education, they're on their way, to eliminate Pell Grants, it's part of the plan, and shift the burden of collecting outstanding student loans to the Treasury to eventually move to end student federal loan programs altogether by fully privatizing them. So that's the plan, and they're well on their way since they've already begun collecting on outstanding loans, eliminating forgiveness pathways, and limiting the amount of debt someone can take on. It's all in an effort to crush the existing market so that they can make the case that private markets are way more efficient. Hopefully by now, you're sensing a theme. Privatization is the end game of so much of what they're after. So job one is to prevent them from completely dismantling the student debt infrastructure. So this requires complete victory at the midterms and multiple court challenges just to delay everything. But if we're to move forward thereafter, we have to start voting for people who are committed to fixing the root causes of the debt crisis. So for one, public colleges and universities should be free because they were always supposed to be. But because so many states are upside down, this would have to be a federal government initiative. This isn't as difficult as it seems, though, and we can afford it. You ready? State contributions to higher education, four-year public institutions and two-year community colleges, are around $130 billion a year. So that includes state financial aid contributions as well. The federal government, though, right now allocates less than $1 billion in assistance. But the states only cover about 50% of the costs, so the other half of that is borne by students paying for tuition, housing, and dining, along with research grants and donations from endowments. So let's say that all told, it's $260 billion all in to have free public college. I say the federal government institutes a matching system. States kick in $130 billion and the feds match it. The important thing here is that this kind of spending is non-inflationary. Like just because people have free access to public colleges and universities doesn't all of a sudden mean that there's going to be tons of new money running through the system that will increase and contribute to inflation. Moreover, it would actually reduce inflation among private competitive schools. And here's how. By making public colleges far more competitive and free, it puts market pressure on private colleges to part with some of their endowments and to slow the pace of tuition growth. See, if all of a sudden the state public university grows in prestige, it has all the bells and whistles of a private college and is free to attend, the private colleges would have to reduce their costs to compete. And if they don't, who cares? The idea is to give a good quality free education to as many people as possible, because that's kind of part of the American promise. But the other way is to force these private institutions to have some skin in the game. See, they all participate in taking federal loan money, and it's guaranteed to the college. They have no skin in the game. And I'm all for federal loan programs, but the character of these loans and the securitization of them has to fundamentally change. And on this, we have the answer. It was actually dating back to Lyndon Johnson's administration when the idea of debt for colleges was originally introduced. LBJ's idea was that there would be an insurance pool that colleges and the government pay into to cover defaults. So the colleges have skin in the game. But the linchpin of this idea is to forgive a substantial portion of older loans and drastically cut the interest rate on all outstanding loans. And this works in a couple of ways. First of all, like I said, I'm all for forgiveness at any level, 10 grand, 20 grand, whatever. Deal with the problem at hand to give the majority of debt holders a little breathing room. There's no reason why student debt, though, should be priced at 7 to 8%. See, the federal government should refinance the outstanding balance of every single loan out there at the federal funds rate. Let people borrow at the same rate that the banks do, and extend the terms of the loans out of the gate. So this would dramatically reduce the monthly payments. Moreover, to drive the nail in Sallie Mae's coffin, refinancing in this fashion should be available for all private loans as well. See, most people think that Sallie Mae is a government lender. It's guaranteed by the government, but it's a private lender. It's the ultimate scam for another day. See, Sallie Mae is a private corporation owned mostly by some of the largest hedge funds and the private equity firms in the world, like BlackRock. Yeah. So we shouldn't be giving them more business. We should be putting them out of business. But you know what else this does for the federal government? When you give people a shot to repay their loans by lowering the amount and the rate, it all but eliminates defaults, which means it's more successful and self-funded over time. In fact, it becomes a profit center to help offset the matching funds to public colleges. Pretty neat, huh? And for God's sake, stop with the means testing. It's just wrong and mean. Wealthy people don't carry student debt. High net worth families and individuals don't have student debt. That's just not how it works, nor has it ever. And stop worrying about the feelings of people who paid off their loans. For every one of them, there's another older person and sometimes senior citizen who's still paying theirs off and struggling. Did you know that there's an entire segment of the senior population having their Social Security checks garnished for student loans? And as for the right wing who thinks that it's a handout that steals money from the government, the SBA forgave more than $750 billion in PPP loans after COVID. I got one, and it was forgiven. Thank God. See, this money was treated as below-the-line income, and therefore non-taxable. In other words, free money. Of the hundreds of billions of dollars in tax cuts under Bush, Obama, and Trump that favored the wealthy, I think that the entitlement argument should be focused there. So don't accept that when you hear it. Let's put Sallie Mae out of business. Let's make colleges put some skin in the game. Let's make public college free again. Offer some relief today and fix the system for tomorrow by refinancing at the same rate the banks pay. This is the battle we need to wage when we retake control of the government. These are the kind of things that we need to do to regain the trust of our youth. These are the investments into their education and futures that we need to make. And if you want to read 2 incredible books on credit and debt, I've added these ones to the MeidasMax list on bookshop.org. The first one is The Color of Money by Mehrsa Baradaran, one of my favorite authors. I cannot say enough about this book. It is a tour de force through the history of money in America and the importance of credit, banking, and debt, and how white America was able to keep wealth in white communities. The other one is The Debt Trap by Josh Mitchell. Now, this one gives you chapter and verse on how student loans became the thing of nightmares and how they contributed to rising tuitions and Wall Street scams. So that's all for now. For the MeidasTouch Network, I'm Max from UNFTR. You can find me on Blue Sky and YouTube at UNFTR, and don't forget to sign up for our free weekly newsletter at unftr.com. Thanks as always to the Meidas Mighty, and I'll catch you in the next video.
Can't get enough Meidas? Check out the Meidas Plus Substack for ad-free articles, reports, podcasts, daily recaps from Ron Filipkowski, and more. Sign up for free now at MeidasPlus.com.